welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host, Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to be wrapping up our testing series with end-to-end testing. So end-to-end testing is when we're clicking through the browser like a user might, but we automate that process. So end-to-end tests are great for testing our UI and our routing and other things that simulate a user's behavior in our application. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a framework called TestCafe that's built into PUP to run our tests and see how we actually simulate a user doing things like clicking on buttons and filling out forms and navigating between pages. And we're going to write some automated tests to simulate that process for creating a new document inside of PUP, as well as viewing a new document that we've just created. So if you're ready, let's get started. Alrighty folks, before we get started, I want to remind you to head over to cleverbeagle.com/pup and clone a copy of PUP, which is the boilerplate that we use with mentees at Clever Beagle, and it contains everything you're going to need to write and run end-to-end tests. And I highly recommend heading over to the documentation and checking out the section on end-to-end tests to get up and running as quickly as possible. Well, there are a lot of different ways to go about writing and running end-to-end tests. In the context of PUP, I've chosen to use a library and a suite of tools known as TestCafe. And TestCafe is a complete end-to-end web testing framework. And TestCafe comes in a few different varieties. So here I'm looking at the open source or free version of TestCafe. And this is on GitHub. So this is just the basic GitHub page for this project. But the reason I wanted to point this out is that TestCafe has both a free product and a paid product. And PUP relies on the free product. So I would highly recommend checking out the paid product, but for the context of this tutorial, we're going to be looking at the free product. And what I wanted to point out before we actually get into working here is the website for this. So this is devexpress.github.io. So devexpress is the team that's building TestCafe. So devexpress.github.io/TestCafe, and then going to /documentation will get you into the API documentation, which is going to cover all of the different functionality that we're going to use during this tutorial. To get started working with TestCafe, what we're going to do is look at the package.json file that's located at the root of PUP, or the root of our project. And what we want to look at in here are two things. So the first is that we've installed TestCafe in PUP, and this is included in PUP's package.json. So as soon as you clone PUP, you're going to have access to this. But in case you're watching this and you're going to do this independently, you'll notice that under our dev dependencies inside of package.json, we have TestCafe installed as a package. So that's required in order to run our tests that we've written via TestCafe. And you'll also notice up in the scripts block of package.json, we have a npm script called test-e2e. So end to end. We're just writing it a little shorter here so we don't have to type all that out when we want to run our tests. And inside of that script, what we're doing is we're calling TestCafe, which is a shell script that's going to be called. So that's given to us by installing the TestCafe npm package. So we're going to say TestCafe, and then we're going to pass the name of a browser that we want to run. And then you'll see here we've got colon followed by the word headless. So what this is doing is saying we're going to run our tests in the Chrome browser, but we're not going to launch an actual instance of a Chrome browser. So what that means is if I got rid of this, when we run our tests, we'll actually see a Chrome browser spawn on our desktop, and TestCafe will go through and run our tests in that browser, which is really cool. But for the sake of time and speed and efficiency, as well as running your tests in the context of a continuous integration system, it's not the best thing to have. But in terms of, like a party trick and wow factor, it's one of the coolest things in the world. So in the case of this tutorial, we're just going to run stuff in headless mode. So we're saying run our tests in Chrome in headless mode, and then this is known as a file glob. So what this is doing is it's saying we only want you to run tests that are located in the UI directory at the root of our project, and we only want to run tests that are located in subdirectories of that UI folder. So those could be infinitely nested, and that's what we're saying here. We're saying with the double star for the slash and the directory name, or where a presumed directory name would be, we're just saying, hey, replace that with whatever the directory name is all the way down until the very deepest level of the UI directory. And then we're saying /star again, but it's important to point out we're saying star.e2e.js. So what this is doing is it's saying only run test files that contain .e2e.js in the file name. And so what this is doing is it's pointing TestCafe directly to the files that are relevant to TestCafe or relevant to our end-to-end testing. And if you've been watching this testing series, you'll notice that when we were working with Jest, which is the other testing framework that we use in PUP, we had .test.js files. So this is just separating out the different versions. And here, this is a customization in PUP, the .e2e.js. That's not a convention that's introduced by TestCafe. That was by us, and that was because TestCafe recommends using .test.js, but we wanted to get around those conflicts with Jest, so we changed it to .e2e.js so that this would run without a lot of headaches. So before, when we were working with unit tests and integration tests, what you may have noticed is that we didn't really spend a lot of time in the browser. And the reason for that is that unit tests and integration tests relative to Jest, the testing framework that we are using to write and run those tests, didn't really need a running instance of the application. It was able to test our code without a running instance of the application. So when it comes to end-to-end testing, that story changes. So you'll notice here I've got a copy of PUP up and running, and I've logged in as the user+1@test.com email address. And so what we need to do is not just have a running copy of the browser up, but we also need to move our thinking or shift our thinking to the browser or to our front-end code. And the reason why is that end-to-end tests are designed to simulate an actual user using our application. So earlier when we talked about the command to run our end-to-end test, we were saying it's going to launch an instance of Chrome, or we hinted at it launching an instance of Chrome when our end-to-end tests run. And that literally happens. So when you're running end-to-end tests, what we're going to do is actually simulate the path that a user would take in our application. And so what we mean by that is we're literally going to click on buttons in our interface, and we're going to type into inputs, and we're going to move between pages and things like that. So actions that an actual user would take, we're going to take. And so for our end-to-end test, where we're going to start is with the creation of a new document in PUP. So this is a good way to verify that a new document is being created. So you'll notice that if I go back to the documents page here and I click the new document button, PUP is designed to create a brand new document for you. So it redirects you to the ID of the document that was created /edit. So document / the ID / edit. And on that page, it gives you the editor, so you can say, start writing my document. And so what we want to verify with our end-to-end test is that we can actually do that. So if our application is working as expected, we should be able to log in as user+1@test.com, click on the new document button, and get to this page specifically. So get to this URL, and we should be able to see this input with the words untitled document somewhere in there. So the number is a little less relevant because that's going to change, but as long as we can see a text input with this value in it, we know that we're doing the correct thing. So just like we did in our last tutorial, I've gone ahead and written out our test code that we're gonna step through today. So the thing to keep in mind with all forms of testing, unit testing is somewhat excluded from this, but can be wrapped into it, which is testing takes some form of thought. It takes some time and it takes some thinking, but the point is that the time you're spending doing that up front is saved later when you're not having to fix the bugs that those tests can shine a light on when you're in your development phase. So again, I've gone ahead and written our test file here, and we can see that this is very similar to what we saw with our unit tests and integration tests when we were working with Jest, though it is a little bit different. So what's going on in here is that we're creating a test suite along with a set of tests. So remember that the word suite is important. So a suite is a collection of tests that are related to some functionality in our application. And so what we can see at the top of our page here is this word fixture, and it's calling a function called fixture, and we're saying fixture, and then we pass the name or the path /documents, and that's followed by another method called page. So fixture here is the term that TestCafe uses to create a test suite. So fixture and suite are analogous in terms of what we've learned so far in regards to testing. So what we're doing here is we're saying create a test suite or a fixture called /documents. So when it comes to end-to-end testing, I found that it's helpful to tell yourself what URL you're testing or what page you're starting from. And the reason for that is that you're testing UI. So you want to think like a user might think, like, oh, okay, I'm going to test from the documents page, or I'm testing something on the documents page. So that's what we're doing here. We create our fixture or our test suite, and then this .page method is kind of neat. What this is doing is it's allowing us to tell TestCafe where we want our test to originate from. So remember that TestCafe is running our tests in a browser and pretending to be a user. So just like we might talk to a user on the phone and we say, hey, go to this URL and then type this in and blah, blah, blah. TestCafe is doing the exact same thing. So what we're doing here is we're saying kick off our suite or our fixture at this URL. So we're saying go to this and then perform our test. And then down here, when it comes to writing our test, we'll notice that the structure of our individual tests is very, very similar to what we saw with Jest. So the idea here is that we have a function called test that defines our test, followed by a string that describes the test, followed by a function that actually executes or runs our test. So this function, again, just like we saw with Jest, is the function that's performing the test. That is the actual test for all intents and purposes. But the difference that you'll see between what we've got here in a TestCafe test versus something like Jest is that we're dealing with a slightly different syntax and API for running our tests. So what we're going to do is step through all of this. So again, we need to remember that we're pretending to be a user here. So we have to follow every step that a user is going to take in order to actually use our application. So the first thing I want to point out here, and we're going to focus on this test here, so should allow users to create a new document. So again, back in the browser, this is if we're on the documents page, a user should be able to click a new document and have a new document generated. So what we're going to do for this test, you'll notice that when we call this function to run our test, we're past the browser instance. So the browser instance is literally the running browser that TestCafe has created or spawned in order to run our test. So what that does is it gives us access to the DOM and a few other things to actually interact with the browser as the test is running. And so the very first thing that we're going to do is run this login function here. And you'll notice that login is coming from this file up here. So tests/helpers/e2e. And so that helper, if we go over here, so this is at the root of pup. So we've got the test directory, and then underneath that we've got a helpers directory, and then e2e.js. And this is written by myself. So this is added to pup as a helper for you. So this is just performing common tasks related to end-to-end tests. And just like we saw before, we also have those for integration tests and unit tests as well. So when it comes to our end-to-end helpers, or in this case, the login helper, what we're doing here is we have a function that performs the steps related to logging a user in, or how a user is actually going to log in. So what we can see here is that quite literally, in order to log in a user, what we're doing is we're telling TestCafe to type some text into an input with a given selector. So you'll notice here we're saying browser type text into some selector called data test email address, and then we're doing the same thing with password, and then clicking the button. So quite literally, we're going through the process that a user would to log into our application. And so you can see up here, we're passing email, password, and then browser. So back in our test, email and password are what we've typed here, and then browser is that browser instance that's generated specifically for our test. So back over here, what we're doing is we're saying, okay, take that browser instance, and then we want to interact with it. So we're going to say fill out the email address, fill out the password, and then click the submit button to trigger the login. And then down here you can see we've got something that's a little bit funky. So what this is saying is we want to select an element on the page, or attempt to select an element on the page. And here we're saying that element is going to have an attribute data test user nav dropdown. So though this should be making some sense in terms of what's happening here, so we're typing this email address that we've passed into this email address input, and we're typing in this password into this password input. What may not be making a ton of sense is this data-test equals thing. So what this is, if we jump down, so we're going to go to UI, pages, login, and then we're going to open up index.js. We're going to scroll down to our form here. So what these are test-specific, or rather end-to-end test-specific selectors for elements in our UI. And the reason we do this in PUP is that end-to-end tests are, by their very nature, fragile. So what we mean by that is, because we're using HTML or CSS selectors to test certain elements, meaning we want to type into an input called email address, or we want to type into an input called password, or click a submit button, or some interaction with elements on the page, it's common that as developers, at some point we're going to change our UI. So we're going to change things like class names, we're going to change IDs if we're using those, we're going to change name attributes, and we're going to do that for a number of different reasons. And so what we want to avoid with our end-to-end tests is constantly having to rewrite them because we changed our selector names, which is a real pain in the butt. So what we do in PUP is we say, well, let's just add a data-test attribute, which allows us to select that element, but it allows us to give that element a name that we don't have to change unless we really, really want to. So that means that we could come in here and then we could say, maybe for some silly reason we wanted to change email address to user email address. Well, what's nice about this is now we can still run this test and have it pass, because we know that we're selecting the email address input, but it doesn't match the actual name that we're using or the actual selector that we're using in relation to our own code. So our form submission process might rely on this name attribute being different than our data test, but that doesn't matter because our test can pinpoint this test specific selector. So with all of that in mind, what I'm going to do is I'm going to back this up a little bit, make sure that's saved. Okay, we're good. So what we're going to do is go back to our helper again just to make sure this is clear. So now that we understand this bracket notation, this is just us saying select an HTML element with a data attribute. So this isn't specific to TestCafe or anything in PUP. This is just how you write a JavaScript selector for an attribute, an HTML attribute in JavaScript. So we're saying we want to select the element. And technically, this isn't just JavaScript, this is also CSS. So if we wanted to write some CSS rules, and I'll just kind of jot this out down here, we would write something just like that, and then we could say, I don't know, background is not Gaussian blur element. Blur. Wow, my text editor really wants that. All right, so we're just going to say blue. There we go. So we're going to say we could do this exact selector. We could say data test equals email address, just like that, and select that element. So now that we understand that, we're going to type in an email, type in a password, and then we're going to click the submit button. Just to make sure that's clear, down here we have a submit button to log the user in. So what's going to happen then, let's back this up as well, is this helper function is going to perform those steps for us so that we don't have to write them into our test every single time we want to log a user in. So back here what we can see is we're saying login, but before it we have the word keyword, or the await keyword. And so what that's doing is it's using JavaScript's async await syntax to run these tests. And the word await is pretty helpful here. It tells us more or less what's happening. So async await is a way to run JavaScript code that's asynchronous in a synchronous fashion, or rather, it allows us to wait on asynchronous code. So if you've ever worked with asynchronous code before, it's code that you call a function and then that function has a callback function that's called after it completes. And that's really great when you don't need to wait on things happening in order to execute your code. But when it comes to something like end-to-end tests, we have to remember that we're simulating a user's behavior, and so we need to wait on certain tasks to complete in the browser before we move on. And so conveniently, what we get in TestCafe is the ability to easily use async await. So a lot of the functionality that's built into TestCafe is based on promises. And so that's something that you'll hear in relation to async await. So when we're dealing with the await keyword, we're expecting whatever we're awaiting on to return a JavaScript promise. So in this case, because our code here is using all of this TestCafe code, so we're saying browser type text and selector and browser.click, those are coming from TestCafe, and those are returning promises. So we don't have to do that specific to this function. It's already handled for us. But the important part is that that's going to return a promise that we can wait on. So quite literally what's going to happen here is we're going to call login, and we're going to wait for that login step to complete. Or in other words, we're going to wait for all of this to take place. So we're going to wait for this to happen, to type in the password, to click the button, and then this is the important part. So we're waiting for this to exist. And so just like we did with our email address and our password inputs, we can see that here data test equals user nav dropdown is saying, if we go into, this is going to be under UI components and authenticated navigation in pup. So if we go into index.js here, we can see that we have a user navigation dropdown right down here, and we've added data-test equals user nav dropdown. So if that exists, that means that our user has successfully been logged in and our test is complete. So what's going to happen is TestCafe is going to wait for that element, and it has a fixed timeout. I want to say it's 10 seconds, but I'm not 100% certain, but it's going to wait some amount of time for that element to exist. And in the context of something like Meteor or any single page application framework or JavaScript single page application, that's invaluable because you're always going to have some amount of wait time. It may just be, and hopefully a few milliseconds, but we all know that sometimes networks get bogged down and it takes a little bit longer for things to appear. So what this is going to do is it's going to wait a fixed amount of time, or up to a fixed amount of time, for that element to exist. But once it does, that means that, okay, this step is complete. So we're no longer waiting. That work has been done. So with all of that in mind, we have a better idea of what else is happening inside of our test. So we can see what we're doing is we're saying login, and then we want to click on the new document button. And now we're making some assumptions here. So this test is only seeing if we can create a new document. But you may be wondering, well, wait a minute, how do we know that the new document button is there? And the way that we know it's there is if the login page is behaving correctly. We'll look at our index.e2e.js for the login page. We can see that we expect to log in and then get to the /documents page. Now this end-to-end test is built into pup. This isn't something that we're writing specific to this tutorial, but just keep in mind that what's happening here is we're already verifying that, hey, our login action works. So we log the user in, and that should redirect the user to the /documents page. And that /documents page, if we go back to our browser, is where this new document button exists. And so that's how we're making the assumption back here in our documents page test that new document button exists. And you can see here, data-test equals new document button has been added. So if we go over to, let's see here, we want the documents page, we can see that the new document button has been given a data-test equals selector, or equals new document button selector. And so now back in our test, we can click that button and go on verifying that everything is working as expected. So we click that new document button, and if everything is behaving properly or our code is working, we would expect that we're going to be redirected to a page or to a URL that contains /edit. So if we go back to our browser here and we step through this, so we're going to say click new document button, and we expect the page URL to contain /edit if everything worked according to plan. So we can see here, this is a randomly generated ID, so we don't want to test for that. We just care that, hey, did you get to the /edit page? And we'll notice that that's only part of our test. So we're trying to say we expect this to happen. We expect the page to contain edit, but we also, and then we go down to our last verification step here, we're saying we expect the browser. So this is just syntax here. There's nothing special about this. We're just adding a line between browser and expect. So don't let that confuse you, but we're saying browser.expect some selectors. So in this case, data test equals document title. And what we're going to do is go over here real quick to make sure we understand where that is. So in pup, we have the edit document page, which renders the document editor component. And the reason we do that is just to separate the logic so we don't have these massive component files. So what we're technically doing, even though we're going to the /edit page, which renders this edit document component, what we really care about is the document editor component rendered here. And if we jump over to that, we can see that here we've got the view document button, and we also have the, where'd it go here? This is one I'm looking for. So we're looking for data test equals document title. So what this is doing back in our test is allowing us to verify that our new document was created and given an actual name, or given the proper name. So here we can see we're selecting data test document title, and we're looking at the value. So we're assuming that document title is going to be an input, which we know because we added that selector directly to our title input. And so back in our test, we're saying give us the value of that, and we expect the value returned by that code to contain untitled document and then the # or number symbol. So if we jump back in the browser, we should see untitled document number and then some randomly generated number based on however many documents that we have in our code. So with that test complete, now what we're ready to do is actually run our test. Now this is going to potentially be a little more frustrating than our unit tests and our integration tests. And the reason why is that we have to remember our end-to-end tests are literally following the actions that a user would in the browser. So they're inherently slower. So it's just going to take more time for that process to complete. So this is definitely one of those things where over time, as your test suite builds up or your end-to-end test suite builds up, you want to plan on saying, okay, I'm going to let these tests run and go get a cup of coffee, because it will take some time. Now, some of you may say like, well, wait a minute, aren't there frameworks out there that do this a lot faster? There are, and there's one in particular that is very attractive, but in my own work on PUP, I found wasn't the best fit, at least not yet, which is called Cypress. So Cypress is an end-to-end testing framework that's really popular in the JavaScript community, and it's lightning fast. I'm not entirely certain how they do it, but it is lightning fast. And what I found is that while it did work with Meteor and did work with PUP by extension, there were times where I was getting inconsistent results based on that speed. So I found that sometimes it evaluated a test a little too quickly, and so something like a login event didn't have time to complete, or a redirect didn't have time to complete. So I would get false negatives in my tests sporadically. So I would get 3 successes in a row, and then I'd get a failure without having changed my code at all. And so once I ran that through the paces, I realized, you know what, this isn't smart. So TestCafe seems to be the framework that works best with the technology that we're using, but that doesn't mean that it's the only option out there. So if you're wondering about that, something to keep in mind. So in terms of running our tests, what we're going to do is jump over to our terminal, and you can see here I'm in the directory for this project. And like we saw earlier, we defined a script, an npm script, called test e2e. So what we're going to do here is we're going to say npm run test e2e, and we can see that we run our TestCafe Chrome headless with our path to our e2e.js files. And then it just tells us, hey, I'm going to step through these tests. So again, there's some built-in end-to-end tests in PUP already that it's going to run through, but what we're after is this one, the documents tests. So we can see here, it's really slow. It's not whipping through these. It's as quick as it can be, but it's not going to speed through it. And we can see that, okay, our documents tests are passing. We're able to create a new document, and we're going to look at this other one next, which is the view a document. We can see that once that executes, all of our tests have passed. So if we jump back to our code, that means, great, we're able to create a new document and get to it, which is wonderful. And then down here we have another test that's allowing us to view a document or check if a new document is viewable. And what we mean by that is once we get to this page, we're in editing mode, but PUP also has a view document mode. So if I click this button in the top left corner of the edit page and I go to view document, we should be able to get to this page, which is what we expect the public or anybody we've shared our document with to be able to see. And so this test down here is saying should allow users to view a new document. And just like we saw before, we have our function that gets called, and we're doing this async so that we can await each step. So we get that. Again, I'm not 100% sure of the timeout, but I think it's about 10 seconds. So we get a 10-second timeout on each of these steps. We wait for up to 10 seconds for a step to complete. So we say, go ahead and log the user in. And then we want to click the new document button. And that's something we're already familiar with. So that's on the documents page. We should be able to click the new document button. Next, we want to click on the document settings button. Now this is new. So if we go over to the document editor here and go up to the top, we have the document settings button here. So data test equals document settings button. And if we go back to the browser real quick and we go to, let's create a new document. This button that I'm clicking right here is the document settings button. And then if we go down just a little bit, we'll notice that's a drop down button. And so in that drop down menu, we also have the view document button. And so the view document button is this one right here. So we're saying click the document settings button and then click view document. And so if we jump back to our test, we click document settings, view document, and then our test or our verification is to say the data test document title selector should have inner text. So notice this is a little bit different. Up here we said data test document title.value because we were dealing with an actual input, a text input. But down here we're dealing with static data, not an input. So we're going to use the .inner text value that's returned by the selector function. And if we go and look at our view document component, we can see here that this H1 has data test document title. So that H1 is this H1 right here. And so what we're saying is add the selector to that, and we want to verify that its inner text contains, just like we saw with our input, untitled document, and then the pound sign or dollars, or not dollar sign, pound sign or number symbol. And if that exists, then we're all good to go and our code is working. So there you have it. That is writing and running end-to-end tests. Now again, we were using the framework TestCafe to do this, but they're just like we talked about with Jest and other test frameworks for doing unit and integration tests. There are a lot of different options for doing end-to-end testing. So this may not be the only one that you see. There's a lot of different ones, but they're all trying to achieve the exact same thing, which is running tests that simulate a user clicking and filling out things in our browser and actually behaving. So that's another name you'll hear for these types of tests, is behavioral testing. So they're testing the behavior of a user in the actual application. Now, before I let you go, I do want to make a point about this. So you may have noticed that this is a little bit easier, relatively speaking, to integration testing and end-to-end testing. We didn't really do any mocking or anything like that. And that's great, but it's important to note that, again, end-to-end tests are very fragile. So you don't want to make this your only mechanism for testing. So end-to-end tests are great for verifying that things like your routing are working in the browser and that you can get to certain pages or you can fill out forms and things like that, but they're not 100% bulletproof. So you want to complement your end-to-end tests with unit and integration tests like we saw in the previous two Feature Fridays. So don't forget that. It's great to start with end-to-end testing. It's a really easy way to dip your toes into automated testing as a whole, but don't just stop with end-to-end testing. Make sure that you're considering all aspects of your application, because even though you may write code for the browser that does what you expect, so you can fill out a form and you can get to a new page, you also have to remember that you have code on the server side that's going to perform some functionality. So when we saw our integration tests, we were working with user data and updating a user's profile. So even though we were able to submit the form in the browser, which our end-to-end tests might have tested, when it came to the actual code on the server that performed that transaction with the database to update the user's data, we can't confirm just via our end-to-end test that that code is working. So we need to test both facets of it. So when you think about testing and you're starting to test your own product, make sure to keep that in mind, because otherwise you may leave some gaps in terms of your test coverage, and you might get surprised by some bugs that you thought didn't exist but actually did. They were just hiding in a spot you hadn't written tests for. So that's going to do it for this Feature Friday. I really appreciate you watching. And if you haven't already, make sure to head over to our YouTube page and click on the subscribe button so that you get all of these Feature Fridays as soon as they're published. And also make sure to click on the bell, so if you want to get the notification in the top right on YouTube, so as soon as we publish, you'll get new notifications about new episodes and all that fun. So that's going to do it for this Feature Friday. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next week. If you enjoyed this tutorial, I'd really appreciate it if you head over to cleverbeagle.com/subscribe and sign up to get our latest tutorials and advice in your inbox as soon as they're published.